basically, I'll touch on some of the most common scenarios that we get. So the first one is positive test result, required to isolate for 7 days. Been in this boat myself early this month. So obviously a person tests positive, and even if they are well after a day, certainly they're still required to isolate for that particular period. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't do work in that 7 days. So Miles, a lot of employees may very well say, I'm unwell, I can't work, and so on. Others may feel good after on the second day. I was fortunate enough to be one of those, and started working from home straight away during that period. So it's good to keep in touch with your employees, not only to show that you care, but also so that those opportunities might present themselves where there can be a continuation of work during that isolation period. So particularly if you're struggling for staff numbers. So that's the main requirement, certainly in New South Wales. The evidence is, a PCR test or the RAT tests or medical certificate, which are available online. In terms of working from home, we just touched on that it is possible during that 7 day period. Obviously, they can't go out to clients, but can do things from home. And typically, for that employee who tests positive, personal leave will apply for the period that they are unwell. Now, this poses an interesting question. If an employee is unwell for 3 days, but they've got to isolate for 7, do they get personal leave for the whole 7 days, or is it only for the 3 days? And I think that's a question that's subject to interpretation, because theoretically, the two things that we've just spoken about are separate. The isolation period is one thing, and that applies regardless of how you're feeling in terms of whether you're unfit or fit for work. And the illness is separate from that. So the illness could be 7 days, could be more than 7 days, or it could be a day. So those are interesting scenarios that we deal with clients every day. And typically, I'll just get to some of the close contact stuff in a moment, but typically, personal leave applies for the period that they are unwell. That's the most important definition and understanding of that. In terms of close contact isolation, so the definition of close contact has been narrowed. Now it relates to persons in the same household or persons that have stayed overnight at a particular place with someone else positive, or close interaction such as a long car trip, for example. Typically, that same requirement would apply to an isolation period for 7 days. And in this particular situation, the person is not entitled to personal leave. So they are entitled to unpaid pandemic leave. However, there are a number of situations where a person who is in the same household as a person who has contracted COVID-19 may also be able to use carers leave to care for that person. Now, this is a tricky one because we get this a lot, and I think some people will try and milk this. They'll say, well, I have to isolate. I'm caring for my son, daughter, wife, whatever it may be, in respect to these matters. Now, reflecting on my own experience of getting COVID earlier this month, I was going to say in early January, I reckon for the first half a day, I might have needed a bit of support, but then after that, absolutely nothing. So I don't think that the person or the employee can necessarily just drag that out for the whole 7 day period. I think the employer is reasonable to ask, if a person is providing care and support, well, what exactly care and support are you providing? Or is this just a way of trying to use paid sick leave entitlements to cover isolation? Now, look, obviously some employers are going to be more lenient on these things than others, but ultimately, what I try to encourage employers to do is to get the maximum value that they can. There's a lot of businesses at the moment that are not necessarily doing things smooth sailing, and just paying people for 7 days on COVID or 7 days on isolation each and every single time is not necessarily practical and viable. So there are a number of, let's call them tricks up the sleeve, for people to challenge certain claims made by employees, because there is some, unfortunately, that are gilding the lily, so to speak, on these things, that are saying, well, I'm caring for this person for the next 7 days. that may not be true at all. They may not be caring for that person for much more than a day, and that's certainly something to take into account. Got a interesting question here from Mark. If an employee can no longer work because of a blood clot caused by the vaccine, can they claim workers' compensation? I think it depends. So it depends on whether or not the vaccination was mandated by the employer or by the industry. So there's probably two ways that could go. The first way that could go is that obviously the government has a compensation scheme, which does have some limitations. There has been some criticism about this scheme because it only really takes into account serious reactions and problems. Now, as I understand it, under this compensation scheme, $5,000 is let's call it the gateway, and basically, if your costs, so to speak, or if the injury, inconvenience, or costs have been above that, you can claim. Now, my understanding is to date, there's been around about 10,000 people that have applied for that particular scheme. So that's pretty concerning, to be quite honest, and that tells me there's going to be a lot of money spent on those adverse effects. In terms of workers' compensation, again, I think it depends on the industry, because it depends on whether the employment is a substantially contributing factor, and we look at this across the board. So, if a person gets a knee injury, did that knee injury occur at work or not? Same thing with this, is did a person get the vaccine because they just decided to get the vaccine, or did they get the vaccine because it was mandated by their employer or mandated by a public health order? So that's the important question, I think, in that. What I would say is I think people are more likely to go the government's compensation scheme, potentially because there's a perception that it's easier. I would like to take that question on notice, Mark, and go away and have a look at whether there is some really good case studies of what you've just described, because I did flag this as a concern with a client on a mandatory vaccination policy that they were putting forward. We've said from the start that, look, we think that the best approach is to follow the government mandate and no more. And I think what that ultimately does is that even if you had, let's say, a staff of 10, and even if, let's say, all of those 10 people happen to have got vaccinated, it comes down to, well, did the employer mandate that, or did that just happen by the individuals making that decision for themselves? And I think that if it's the latter, well, I don't think it is workers' compensation. That the employment has to be a substantially contributing factor, and if there's no mandate or no requirement for that work, then I can't see how there can be that link made. So it's a question of the decision to get vaccinated and who ultimately drove that decision. Did the employee drive that decision, or was the employee really left with no choice but to take that decision? So, and again, I think that probably feeding back into the recruitment stuff we spoke about before, I think that there's obviously some industries that have a public health order, and they are required to follow that public health order for the purposes of the work that they carry out or the work that the clients carry out. But I think that there's probably a number of employers that are, I would say, unnecessarily creating a mandate in their own workplace, which is actually probably costing them in terms of potential people they can recruit. And it's probably also, they probably don't realise their sort of where they're positioned in the market. So a lot of big companies have done it, and a lot of those big companies pay big money for those people to work for them, obviously. But small employers who don't pay well trying to do the same mandates, I think is I think it's a recipe for failure, to be quite honest, particularly if it's not in an industry where the government requires. So great question, Mark. Sorry, I got a little bit off track there with that, but I hope that gives you some interesting insight on that as well. Got another question here I'll take as well. Offering personal leave will be very costly for a business and demoralising for staff. Staff cannot work from home, use up half their sick leave along with depleted annual leave is concerning. while the business is continuing to pay wages combined with replacing those staff will be very costly. Can we just direct unpaid pandemic leave? Great question. Once again, Jed, it depends. If the person is claiming that they are sick, then they're entitled to personal leave. Simple as that. If they've got a positive COVID test, if they've got other evidence demonstrating they're sick from COVID, they can use personal leave. Now, obviously, if they run out of personal leave, they can use annual leave, of course, by agreement with the employer. It doesn't have to be automatic. The employer doesn't have to approve annual leave for a sick purpose, but they can if they choose to. Okay. Now, second part of your question, while the business has had to continue pay wages combined with replacing those staff will be very costly. Yes, there is a lot of that happening at the moment. And again, it goes back to what we spoke about before, that over the past couple of months, we've had some 2 million infections across Australia. Imagine all of the isolation and close contacts that arise from all of those infections. We've had heaps and heaps and heaps of disruption in the last 2 months. And look, I would hope by the end of February that disruption would be on the decline. Obviously, I can't say for certain that would occur. Don't know whether there'll be another wave or whatever it may be. But can we just direct unpaid pandemic leave? Well, unpaid pandemic leave is the default in situations where a person is isolating and is not sick. So that is the default position if they're isolating and not sick. However, if they are sick, personal leave. If they have made a strong argument that they are claiming or that they are caring for another person, then that is certainly another scenario where they could use sick leave. So great question, Jed. I'd love to take that one offline with you actually, and maybe we can help there a bit more directly on that particular situation. Okay, so just back on this as well, we spoke about the working from home. We spoke about mutually agreed annual leave. We spoke about the unpaid pandemic leave. There's also something there about the disaster payments. So unpaid pandemic leave, a person may qualify for some disaster payments, which are still available, as I understand it, from the government. Andrew, are you able to quickly give our listeners a quick update on what your understanding of those disaster payments is?
Yep, for sure. I'm not 100% sure that they're still relevant. I'd have to actually research that. I thought they were all wound up, but there may be some circumstances, some more challenging cases where it may still be applicable. So I'd have to take that one offline. But in general, my understanding is that they're wound up.
Okay. All right. Well, that's a correction then. Yeah. So look, the disaster payments may not be available at this particular point. So we knew they were available a few weeks ago, but may not be available now. So anyway, we'll move on from that. I guess, we spoke about this, the requirement to care for a positive case, whether there is an obligation for an employee to care for an immediate family member or not. That's I know that there's a lot of people that will think, oh, that's an automatic, but it's not really. When you think about, you think about these things, and as I said, reflecting on my own experience, actually probably made me really think about this point, is for how long can a person say that they're actually caring for another person with COVID? And look, if someone's really sick, fair enough, but if they're not, well, then that period might be a very short period of time. That might be 1 day, 2 days potentially. I think a lot of employees will try and make it the whole 7 days to get paid, but I think the employer has the right to push back on that and to actually ask, well, what is the nature of the care and support you're offering, and even ask for evidence of that. Some employers are even going to that extent. What evidence do you have that you are providing care and support, and why? So ultimately, again, that has to be balanced against, the fact that we've got a candidates market. We want to be considerate and caring for our employees and tolerant because there's so many choices. So it's a fine balance. It's towing the line on making sure people don't take the mickey on these things, but also showing that we're caring and considerate as an employer. So it's a hard balance to achieve, and some depends on the sort of circumstances of your business, I suppose. Like doing things like delivering food and supplies, we don't see that as being something that qualifies as really care and support. That can be done outside of working hours. And we spoke about that question of, is care and support even required if a family member is positive? Again, they may not need any care and support. All right.
I might just add to that, Clint, if you just go back, You know,
Sure.
if someone's caring for someone within their household who is a positive case, well, by default, they're required to be isolating themselves, and that would be, in effect, unpaid pandemic leave, as opposed to carers leave.
Yep. No, that's thank you for that, Andrew. And yeah, we touched on that earlier, but good to clarify that as well.